Prince Andrew has already quit his royal duties to hide from this sex scandal, but while he can run, he cannot hide. Australian resident Virginia Giuffre has now sued Prince Andrew, saying he sexually assaulted her when she was 17. And she has filed a case in the United States asking for damages. She says the powerful and rich are not exempt from being held responsible for their actions. And I hope that other victims will see that it is possible not to live in silence and fear, but to reclaim one's life by speaking out and demanding justice. Giuffre has long claimed that convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein, a billionaire who killed himself in jail, trafficked her to the prince, who slept with her 3 times, twice when she was 17.
This guy was sweating all over me, like his sweat was like, it was raining basically everywhere, and I was just like, whoa.
Prince Andrew 2 years ago denied categorically that he had slept with Giuffre.
I can absolutely categorically tell you it never happened.
Joining me is Sky News US correspondent Annelise Nielsen. Annelise, great to catch up with you. Giuffre is an Australian resident. Prince Andrew is in England. The alleged sex happened in London, Manhattan, and on Epstein's private island in the US Virgin Islands. So why is the Prince of all those countries being sued in the US?
Well, because she can, and what's going to be interesting with this as well is that she's suing under civil law, and so then there is a greater chance for any kind of conviction. It only has to be proved on the balance of probabilities. It's also quite important that it's filed in the US because then that ties in the Jeffrey Epstein angle as well, and this has been quite critical to what we've seen from Prince Andrew's approach so far. He stayed quiet in the United Kingdom after that interview that you'll remember was an absolute disaster for the Prince. He said
shocking.
that he would happily speak to FBI agents about what happened, and so far that offer doesn't seem to have been actually taken up at any point.
No, it doesn't seem to have been such a happy possibility for him after all. Is there any chance, do you think, that he will be forced to give evidence in this case?
Well, that's going to be the key issue, is how do you enforce this internationally? There's going to be some political pressure enacted, you can imagine, given that this is so close to the royal family, and that is going to be a key issue here. But it's likely that they will be able to force at least some kind of response out of Prince Andrew. There'll be a summons, and that's going to be the critical issue here. And likely there's going to be some kind of push for reciprocation as well between the two countries, because they are allies. They do have a number of different pieces of legislation that require them to share this information on critical issues like this, but especially when it comes to child abuse, sex trafficking, this is something that there's going to be a lot of support for in the United States in particular.
Absolutely, absolutely. Be interesting to see if Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, if, you know, since they're all into helping victims, etc., weigh in on this issue. We'll see. Alleged victims, I should say. But you are in Canada. The border with the US has been closed because of the virus. Why have you, I think they're open now, aren't they? Because you're there in Toronto. Why have you gone for a look-see?
Well, we've come across the border because I'm pretty lucky having US citizenship. It's only US citizens who are fully vaccinated who've been able to cross the border, but it's a really interesting case study, especially for Australia right now, because Canada was quite slow in rolling out its own vaccine program. And so one of the interesting things about Canada from an Australian perspective is the fact it's kind of that middle ground in between what's been the Australian response so far of heavy lockdown, slow vaccination, and the US response of almost opening up again as soon as you could and seeing that second Delta wave come through. So Canada has now actually overtaken the United States in the fully vaccinated stakes, over 56%. They're well on their way to the 77%. And the government did manage to pull themselves out of some pretty bleak times. I've been speaking to people here about how they feel about their government's response, and they were happy that they managed to pull them out after initially having issues with the rollout. And how they did it was just buying a lot of vaccines, 400 million shots for 38 million people. And that meant when contracts did fall over, they still had supply coming in. That's where Australia hasn't done as well. But there is still time to succeed. And the other interesting thing about Canada is that there's been very low vaccine resistance. Most people here report that they are going to be happy to get the vaccine. Just around 9% say that they're not going to get it. And there hasn't really been a lot of political discussion around it. So these things can be done, but one of the things that was interesting too, I was outside a vaccination centre yesterday with people who, by the Canadian standards, are late getting their vaccines, and many of them were saying that they decided to get it not because any of their friends were haranguing them, not because they were being shamed into it, but they just felt comfortable having the time to do it, and they had enough friends that had done it, that there was kind of that critical mass. So there is a bit of a lesson for Australia. You don't need to be shaming people you know who are hesitant. There's a lot of reasons you might want to look into it, a lot of reasons you might want to do research, but people will come around if you take the time to listen to them.
Well, of course, I think the biggest seller of vaccine is someone who's already had it, who happens to be a neighbour of someone who's a bit hesitant. I think peer pressure or peer example will get rid of a lot of that in time. We just need to be a bit more patient. Annelise, something that matters to me a bit, some coalition MPs like Matt Canavan are calling for Australia to impose a diplomatic ban on next year's Winter Olympics to be held in Beijing. And they want to do this in protest at its human rights abuses, like locking up 1 million Muslim Chinese. Now, I'm dead for this move. British MPs have voted for a diplomatic ban too, which means that athletes can still go to the Games, but politicians won't. Have US politicians backed this as well?
This is something that has been considered in the United States. This is being discussed at length, as you can imagine, with the relationship with China as it is. I know we've spoken about my former colleague, Chang Lei, who's imprisoned in China, and so this is something I've been looking at quite closely. There is a history of diplomatic movements around Olympics, and that's something that could be used to effect, but it would be interesting at this point in time, with just such a sheer breakdown of the relationship, whether you could kind of make any ground on that. And what we are seeing is just this kind of broader discussion around whether this is the time to extend an olive branch, especially when we are, as a country, as Australia, looking for China to be handing over information around the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that initial reach by Australia was met with such violent anger by so many in the international community who are aligned with China. So what we are going to see is this discussion around the Winter Olympics. I can't imagine that it would play a huge part internationally, but these events are all, in their own way, diplomatic events. So, yeah, sorry, Andrew, a bit of a curveball question for me there, so I'm just... Yeah.
But Annelise, I don't know, you know, the idea that if we play nice with China, they're going to cooperate on the Chinese lab theory investigation, I don't buy it. I don't think they've got any intention of doing that. I just think that they would use this as a propaganda excuse, a propaganda event, and it sticks in my craw that we would be sending politicians to sit there and, you know, be props in it's such a wicked regime at the moment that is throwing its weight around, jailing people, crushing Hong Kong civil liberties. I mean, what they've been doing in Hong Kong lately is an utter disgrace.
Look, it's an absolutely fair question to ask, and I think it's important that the discussion's had as well, because that's quite effective, especially in these circumstances. When you look at the history of Australia's relationship with China, I mean, we went through this before where they were completely locked down, and it was those initial advances that saw it open up, that saw conditions improved between the two countries and saw conditions improved for Chinese citizens throughout that whole process. And so there is that argument to it, but these are very extraordinary times. The pandemic's far from over, and there are legitimate questions to be asked about exactly where the origin of this virus came from, because that's going to be critical in making sure that this doesn't happen again. We've seen the US government back Australia in with that in particular, and even the Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spoken about how he wants to see inquiries progress. There was the original inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, which was seen as being very much hampered by the Chinese, that they couldn't effectively get any information out of that. And so this could be a good opportunity, but the other thing to consider just is that we're still kind of so in the throes of this that regardless of what happens in it, we've got to look at longer term thinking. We know the Chinese do. So we might be looking at the months, years ahead, but they look much longer term.
Well, yes, they've been building for this moment of, challenging world domination for some decades. They've got a much longer view of history, I think, than we do with our election cycles. That's one of the advantages of a dictatorship. You don't have to think election cycles. Annelise Nielsen, thank you so much indeed for your time.